Karen expected a perfect flight, a comfortable seat, first-class service, and an experience that matched her status. But when she sees a black man sitting in first class, she immediately assumes he doesn't belong. Without hesitation, she complains to the flight attendants, demanding he be moved. What happens next? A series of unexpected events that turn her entire world upside down. From a seat swap gone wrong to a humiliating realization, and an encounter with someone far more important than she ever imagined. Karen is about to learn a lesson in humility that she will never forget. How does it all unfold? And by the time this flight lands, will Karen be the same person who boarded? Stay tuned to find out. And before we begin, make sure to subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. Karen adjusted her designer handbag and smoothed the wrinkles of her crisp white blouse as she stepped onto the plane. She inhaled deeply, letting the scent of luxury surround her. First class, where she belonged. As she reached her seat, she froze. A black man was settling into the plush leather chair next to hers. He was well-dressed, his tailored suit perfectly fitted, his polished shoes reflecting the cabin lights. But to Karen, none of that mattered. He simply did not belong. Her face twisted into a scowl as she flagged down a flight attendant. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp. "I think there's been a mistake. This is first class." The flight attendant, a composed woman in a neatly pressed uniform, blinked. "Yes, ma'am. Is there a problem?" Karen huffed. "I wasn't aware that certain types of people were allowed in first class." She gave the man a pointed look. A hush fell over the nearby passengers. The man, who had been calmly reading a newspaper, slowly folded it and looked at Karen with a polite but unreadable expression. The flight attendant straightened. "Ma'am, all passengers in first class have valid tickets. May I see yours?" Karen smugly handed over her ticket, expecting the attendant to confirm her privileged status and relocate the man. Instead, the woman frowned. "Ma'am," she said, her voice professional but firm. "This is not your seat. You are assigned to a seat in economy class." Karen's mouth fell open. "What? That's impossible." The attendant double-checked. "Your ticket is for seat 32B. This is seat 1A." A few passengers snickered. The black man arched an eyebrow, but remained silent. Karen's face turned red as she snatched the ticket back. "There must be a mistake." The flight attendant sighed. "I can escort you to your correct seat, ma'am." Before Karen could protest further, the man beside her spoke. "No need," he said smoothly. "I don't mind switching seats with her." The attendant hesitated. "Are you sure, sir?" He nodded, flashing a charming smile. "I insist." Karen smirked. Finally, someone who understood that she belonged in first class. The flight attendant guided her to the luxurious seat, and she settled in with a triumphant sigh. But her victory was short-lived. The attendant gestured toward the only available seat for the man, the one right next to the bathroom. Karen's smirk faltered. The man turned to her, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am." For the first time, Karen felt something uneasy stir inside her. But she shook it off. She had won. Or so she thought. As the plane taxied down the runway, Karen leaned back, blissfully unaware that this flight had just begun its descent into chaos. Karen adjusted herself in the plush first-class seat, savoring the soft leather beneath her. She had won. The rightful order of things had been restored. But just as she began to relax, an announcement crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a minor delay due to a passenger's misplaced luggage. We appreciate your patience." Karen exhaled loudly. Of course. Just my luck. She glanced around, hoping to see the face of some disorganized fool responsible for the holdup. A flight attendant approached with a concerned expression. "Excuse me, is there a Karen Thompson here?" Karen sat up straighter. "Yes, that's me." The attendant forced a smile. "Ma'am, your carry-on was flagged at security for exceeding the liquid limit." Airport staff is holding it at the gate. Karen blinked. That's ridiculous. It's a designer bag. Do they have any idea how much it costs? I understand, ma'am, but there were several full-size bottles inside, too large for carry-on regulations. Karen clenched her jaw. So what am I supposed to do? The attendant kept her professional demeanor. You can either check the bag into cargo, or we can dispose of the restricted items. Karen groaned, throwing a glance toward the economy cabin. The man she had just displaced was sitting casually in his new seat, skimming through a magazine as if none of this affected him. He caught her gaze and gave a polite nod. Something about his calmness irritated her further. Fine, she snapped. Just check it, but make sure nothing happens to it. The attendant nodded and walked away. Karen folded her arms, huffing in frustration. This was supposed to be a smooth, relaxing flight. Instead, she was being treated like some commoner. Just as she settled back, another announcement filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we're ready for takeoff. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened. Karen yanked her seatbelt on, eager to forget the past few minutes. But her peace didn't last long. A different flight attendant walked down the aisle, stopping beside her. Excuse me, ma'am, you left something at the check-in counter. Karen scoffed. That's impossible. I have everything I need. The attendant held up a small rectangular slip of paper. Karen's boarding pass. Her stomach dropped. Someone found it and turned it in, the attendant continued. You wouldn't have boarded without it. Luckily, a kind passenger retrieved it for you and passed it along. Karen snatched it from her hand, heat rushing to her cheeks. She barely remembered fumbling through her purse at the counter. How embarrassing. Who brought it? She muttered. The attendant smiled and gestured toward the economy cabin. Karen's heart sank. The black man. She turned, but he wasn't looking her way. He simply flipped a page of his magazine, completely indifferent. For the first time, Karen felt a twinge of something unfamiliar, an uneasy awareness that she had misjudged him. She shifted uncomfortably, trying to brush it off. But then, a scent drifted through the air. A strong, unpleasant smell. She wrinkled her nose and looked around. That was when she realized. She was seated directly in front of the plane's kitchen and restroom area. A flight attendant opened the lavatory door, and Karen caught a fresh wave of an odor that made her stomach lurch. She turned toward the seat where she should have been sitting far away from this nightmare. The man met her gaze again, tilting his head slightly, as if to say, "Still enjoying first class?" Karen scowled and crossed her arms. This flight was already a disaster, but she had no idea it was only getting started. Karen tried to focus on the complimentary champagne in her hand, but the lingering odor from the nearby restroom made it impossible to enjoy. Every time a passenger opened the door, a fresh wave of unpleasantness escaped. She grimaced, covering her nose with a napkin. This was not how first class was supposed to feel. Across the aisle, a flight attendant approached an elderly woman struggling to lift her carry-on into the overhead bin. Karen watched as the man she had displaced, the one she had so openly disrespected, stood up without hesitation and helped the woman. She expected him to simply shove the bag into place and sit down. But no. He smiled, exchanged a few friendly words with the woman, and returned to his seat as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Karen huffed. What was with him? Why did he have to act so decent? Shaking off the thought, she turned back to her champagne, only to find a turbulence bump had sent it sloshing onto her silk blouse. Her mouth fell open. You've got to be kidding me, she hissed under her breath, dabbing at the stain with her napkin. She pressed the call button, summoning a flight attendant. I need a towel and a new drink. This turbulence ruined my blouse. The attendant, a young woman with a polite but tired expression, nodded. Of course, ma'am. Just a moment. Karen leaned back, seething. But before the attendant could return, another announcement crackled through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, We have encountered unexpected strong winds. For your safety, beverage service will be temporarily suspended." Karen's eyes widened. "Wait, what about my drink?" she asked as the attendant passed by again. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she replied. "We have to secure everything." Karen's hands clenched into fists. First the bad seat. Then the lost luggage. Now this? This was unacceptable. Meanwhile, the man in economy, still unfazed, reached into his bag, pulled out a bottle of water, and took a slow, deliberate sip. Karen's eye twitched. Fine. If she could not enjoy first class, she would at least get some sleep. She leaned her seat back, only to feel a jerk to a stop after barely an inch. Confused, she tried again. Nothing. A flight attendant approached with a sympathetic look. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Your seat is in front of the emergency exit row, so it does not recline." Karen stiffened. "You're joking." The attendant shook her head. Karen's nails dug into the armrest. This was worse than economy. Even those seats reclined. Trying to contain her frustration, she turned her gaze toward the man she had traded seats with. He had plenty of legroom and a seat that reclined fully. He adjusted his position, stretching slightly, then glanced up and caught her staring. He smiled. Not smugly. Not mockingly. Just kindly. Something inside Karen twisted. She quickly looked away. The turbulence grew stronger, making the plane shake. Karen gripped her armrest tightly, her heart pounding. She hated flying. The only thing that calmed her nerves on planes was the certainty that she was in control, but nothing on this flight had gone her way. She tried to distract herself by scrolling through her phone, but when she tapped her screen, nothing happened. Her phone was dead. Of course. With no drink, no entertainment, and no comfort, Karen was left alone with her thoughts. And for the first time in a long time, she started to wonder if she had been the problem all along. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her stiff, non-reclining seat. She had tried everything, adjusting her posture, fluffing the tiny airline pillow, even crossing her arms in defiance. But no matter what, she couldn't find a way to get comfortable. Meanwhile, the turbulence refused to let up. Every few seconds, the plane rattled just enough to make her grip the armrest. She stole a glance across the cabin and spotted the man she had forced into economy. To her dismay, he looked relaxed. His seat was reclined, his legs were stretched out, and he was reading his magazine as if he were on vacation. The worst part? Every now and then, he would glance in her direction, not with smugness, not with amusement, but with something even more infuriating: patience. Karen turned away. She refused to let this flight get the best of her. A sudden voice on the intercom caught everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain speaking. Due to the turbulence, we kindly ask that all passengers remain seated with seat belts fastened. For your safety, our cabin crew will pause service until conditions improve." Karen let out a groan. This meant no food, no drinks, and no distractions. She needed something, anything, to take her mind off the discomfort. That was when she remembered the complimentary amenity bag tucked into the seat pocket. Eagerly, she reached down and pulled it out. Finally, something nice. She unzipped it and pulled out a pair of cheap socks. Her eyes twitched. She dug deeper. A sleeping mask. Her frustration grew. She pulled out the final item, a tiny tube of toothpaste, and stared at it as if it had personally offended her. "This is what first class gets," she muttered. A soft chuckle came from across the aisle. Karen snapped her head up and saw the man glancing at her, an amused smile playing on his lips. Her face burned. She stuffed the useless items back into the bag and folded her arms. She had had enough of this humiliation. Determined to salvage some dignity, Karen pressed the call button for the flight attendant. Within seconds, a crew member approached with a pleasant but cautious expression. "Yes, ma'am?" Karen straightened. "I would like to be moved to a different seat." The attendant hesitated. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but first class is fully booked." Karen's jaw clenched. "Then put me back in economy," I don't care, we're just anywhere away from this restroom. The attendant looked around before shaking her head. Unfortunately, ma'am, economy is also full. We're at capacity. Karen felt a mix of anger and despair rise in her chest. She was trapped. And then, as if the universe itself wanted to mock her, a soft ding echoed through the cabin. An older woman sitting across the aisle turned to a flight attendant. Excuse me, miss. I seem to have misplaced my book. The attendant nodded. Of course, ma'am. Let me help you look. Before she could move, the man from economy, the very man Karen had tried to get rid of, stood up. Without hesitation, he bent down, searched for a few seconds, and pulled out a small, well-worn novel from the floor. Is this it? He asked kindly, handing it to the woman. Her face lit up. Oh, thank you. That was very kind of you. He simply nodded and returned to his seat, completely unbothered. Karen clenched her fists. Why? Why did he have to be so effortlessly decent? Why wasn't he angry at her? Why wasn't he gloating? As she stared at him, an uncomfortable realization settled in her chest. She had made a huge mistake. And the worst part? It wasn't over yet. Karen clenched her jaw, staring blankly ahead. The longer this flight dragged on, the clearer it became she was the only one making this miserable for herself. The man she had mistreated had every reason to be smug, to glare at her, to make her feel as small as she had tried to make him feel. Instead, he had done nothing but remain polite and unbothered, helping others without hesitation. Karen hated how that made her feel. She shifted in her uncomfortable, non-reclining seat, exhaling in frustration. This was supposed to be a smooth, elegant experience. Instead, it's a nightmare. Suddenly, a voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've just been informed of stronger headwinds than expected, which may extend our flight time by an additional hour. We appreciate your patience. An extra hour? Karen gritted her teeth as groans spread through the cabin. She had already endured enough. Now she had to stay trapped in this seat for even longer? As if to make things worse, the turbulence picked up again, shaking the plane with enough force to make some passengers yelp. Karen's heart pounded. She hated turbulence. It made her feel helpless. She glanced at the man in economy. He remained calm, eyes closed, completely at peace. Karen forced herself to look away. Why couldn't she be like that? A sudden ding from the intercom interrupted her thoughts. Attention, passengers. We'd like to offer a special treat to one lucky guest today. One of our esteemed travelers, Mr. Simmons, has generously decided to donate his complimentary first-class meal to a fellow passenger. We'll be delivering it shortly. Karen's brow furrowed. Simmons? Before she could piece it together, a flight attendant approached the man in economy with a silver tray. Karen's mouth dropped open. The first-class meal, a beautifully plated dish with a glass of fine wine, was handed directly to him. The man she had tried to remove from first class. Passengers in economy clapped lightly, and some murmured their admiration. Wow, how generous! Such a classy guy. Karen felt sick. She turned to the flight attendant. Wait, why is he getting a first-class meal? The attendant gave her a confused look. Because, ma'am, he's Mr. Simmons. Karen's breath hitched. The Mr. Simmons? The name sounded familiar, and then it hit her. She had read about him in business magazines. Jeffrey Simmons, CEO of the very airline she was flying on. A multimillionaire entrepreneur. A man so successful and influential that first class was practically his second home. And she had treated him like... Her stomach turned. Before she could process the weight of her mistake, another announcement filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we're pleased to welcome a special guest on board today, our very own airline chairman, Mr. Jeffrey Simmons. It's an honor to have him flying with us. A wave of applause spread through the cabin. Passengers turned to look at him, nodding in recognition. Some whispered excitedly. Karen sat there, completely frozen. She had insulted the CEO of the airline. She had demanded that he be removed from first class. She had humiliated herself in front of the most important person on this plane. And the worst part? He had known the entire time. Karen's hands trembled as she looked over at him. He caught her gaze and smiled. Not in mockery, not in revenge, just with genuine kindness. Karen wanted to disappear. For the first time in her life, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't just embarrassed. She was ashamed. Karen felt paralyzed in her seat. Her mind raced through everything that had happened since she stepped onto this plane. Her arrogance, her entitlement, her outright disrespect, all of it now crashing down on her like a tidal wave. Jeffrey Simmons. She had read about him before, had even seen interviews where he spoke about his airline's mission of inclusivity, comfort, and customer care. And yet, she had looked at him, judged him solely by his appearance, and decided that he didn't belong. Karen swallowed hard. What was she supposed to do now? As if sensing her turmoil, Mr. Simmons glanced her way. That same calm, unreadable expression on his face. He had every reason to humiliate her, every reason to expose her ignorance in front of the entire cabin. But he hadn't. Instead, he had switched seats without complaint, helped other passengers, and had just given away his first-class meal. Karen clenched her hands together. The turbulence continued to shake the plane, a perfect metaphor for what was happening inside her. She wasn't used to being wrong. She wasn't used to feeling small. But most of all, she wasn't used to people like Jeffrey Simmons. People who chose kindness when they had every reason to retaliate. Suddenly, the flight attendant reappeared. "Miss Thompson?" Karen flinched. "Yes?" "You left your boarding pass at the check-in counter earlier," the attendant said. "Mr. Simmons was the one who found it and made sure it was sent up to the gate before departure." Karen felt the air leave her lungs. He had helped her. Before she even mistreated him. She gripped the edge of her seat, her entire perspective shifting. A memory surfaced, one of her mother's old lessons when she was a child. If you ever feel the need to judge someone, imagine your whole life being judged by one bad moment. Karen had spent this entire flight judging a man based on nothing but her own biases. And the worst part? If the roles had been reversed, she never would have treated him the way he had treated her. She swallowed past the lump in her throat. For the first time since boarding, Karen felt something entirely foreign. The weight of regret. And she knew she had to do something about it. The problem was she had no idea how. As she sat there, lost in thought, a new problem arose. A real problem. An alarm chimed from the cockpit, followed by the sharp, professional voice of the captain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing unexpected weather conditions. As a precaution, we are requesting that all passengers remain seated and follow crew instructions." Karen's pulse spiked. She didn't like the sound of that. The plane lurched sharply to the right. Passengers gasped, gripping their seats. Karen's heart pounded. This wasn't normal turbulence. She looked toward Jeffrey Simmons, expecting to see some sign of concern. Instead, he was already securing his seatbelt, calm as ever. Then, to her surprise, he turned to her. "You okay?" he asked. Karen opened her mouth and closed it, because, for the first time in this entire flight, she wasn't sure how to answer. The plane jolted again, a sharp dip that sent Karen's stomach lurching into her ribs. Gasps filled the cabin. A few overhead compartments rattled, and somewhere behind her, a child let out a frightened whimper. Karen gripped the armrests, her knuckles white. This wasn't normal turbulence. Her breath came shallow and quick. Her mind screamed at her to do something, anything, but there was nothing she could do. She hated this feeling. The loss of control. The helplessness. And then a voice cut through the panic. "You're going to be fine." Karen turned her head and found him looking at her. Jeffrey Simmons. His tone was steady, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held something unexpected. Reassurance. "Deep breaths," he said. "You're safer than you think." Karen swallowed hard. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but she tried to do as he said. Inhale. Exhale. Slow. Steady. The plane rocked again. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing herself to breathe. Pilots train for this kind of thing all the time. Jeffrey continued, his voice calm. This plane is built to handle rough weather. The best thing you can do is trust the process. Karen wanted to argue, wanted to snap, that he had no idea what she was feeling. But deep down she knew that wasn't true, because Jeffrey Simmons wasn't just a passenger. He was a pilot. Karen blinked at the realization. Of course, as CEO of the airline, it made sense that he would know everything about aviation. Yet another thing she had completely ignored when she first judged him. She took another breath. Her grip on the armrest loosened just slightly. The plane steadied for a moment, though the turbulence still lurked beneath them like a restless sea. Jeffrey leaned back, glancing at the passengers around them. Some clutched their seats, wide-eyed with fear. Others whispered anxiously. Without hesitation, he pressed the call button above his seat. A flight attendant rushed over. Yes, sir? Can I speak to the cabin? He asked, as if he had every right to do so. Karen raised an eyebrow. You can just do that? Jeffrey gave her a small smile. I own the airline. A few seconds later, the intercom crackled to life. Good evening, everyone. This is Jeffrey Simmons, chairman of the airline and a licensed pilot. I just want to personally assure you that everything is under control. Our pilots are well trained for this kind of turbulence, and the aircraft is designed to withstand much worse. If you're feeling nervous, take a few slow breaths and focus on something steady. You're in good hands. The shift was immediate. Passengers relaxed not completely, but enough. Whispered fears turned into murmurs of relief. Karen felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Respect. She had spent this entire flight underestimating this man. But here he was a leader, a problem solver, someone people genuinely trusted. And, for the first time, Karen began to wonder, what if she had been wrong about more than just this flight? The turbulence slowly eased, the plane settling into a steadier rhythm. Karen let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Then, before she could stop herself, she turned to Jeffrey and muttered the words she never thought she'd say. I think I owe you an apology. Jeffrey didn't react right away. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he simply said maybe. And then, to Karen's absolute shock, he smiled. Karen sat stiffly in her non-reclining seat, her mind tangled in conflicting emotions. The turbulence had settled. The fear that had gripped her just minutes ago was fading, but something else lingered, something more unsettling. Humility. For the first time in a very long time, Karen felt the weight of her own arrogance. She had spent this entire flight believing she was superior, assuming that money, privilege, and status made her more deserving of comfort than others. And yet, the very man she had looked down on had been the one to keep her calm, the one to help others, the one to show real leadership. Jeffrey Simmons wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was a better person than she had ever been. And now, she had to face that reality. Karen turned to him, still unsure of how to fix what she had broken. She hesitated, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. I shouldn't have judged you. Jeffrey didn't respond right away. He simply tilted his head, watching her as if assessing whether she was truly sincere. Sight. Look, I know I've been, she gestured vaguely, a bit difficult. Jeffrey let out a small chuckle. That's one way to put it. Karen felt her face flush. All right, fine. I was awful. I assumed things about you without knowing anything. And I was wrong. Jeffrey studied her for a long moment, then nodded. That's a start. Karen raised an eyebrow. A start? He shrugged. An apology isn't just words. It's what you do after that matters. Karen fell silent, because for once, she didn't have a snarky comeback. And maybe that was progress. The cabin was quieter now. Passengers had settled, some whispering, others sleeping. The flight attendants resumed their service, moving calmly down the aisles. Karen stared at her untouched glass of water, deep in thought. She had spent years believing that success was about dominance, about being in control, about making sure she always came out on top. But Jeffrey Simmons had everything: money, power, respect, and he didn't behave that way. He led with grace, with kindness, and somehow, that made him more powerful than any arrogance ever could. Karen sighed, rubbing her temples. "So what now?" she muttered under her breath. Jeffrey glanced at her. "What do you mean?" Karen hesitated, then gestured vaguely. "Do we just pretend none of this happened?" Jeffrey chuckled. "I don't think either of us could forget this flight if we tried." Karen let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, no kidding." A brief silence passed between them. Then Jeffrey leaned back, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Can I ask you something?" Karen raised an eyebrow. "Do I have a choice?" He smirked. "Not really." She rolled her eyes, but motioned for him to continue. "Do you even enjoy first class?" Karen blinked, caught off guard. "What kind of question is that?" "A serious one." Jeffrey studied her. "You've been miserable this entire flight, even before we switched seats. So I'm wondering, does sitting up here actually make you happy?" Karen opened her mouth to argue, to insist that of course it did. But then she hesitated, because, for the first time, she wasn't sure. She thought back to the small things that had irritated her: the service not being fast enough, the champagne not being cold enough, the seat not being perfect. She had spent so much time looking for problems that she had never actually enjoyed the experience. Meanwhile, Jeffrey had been stuck in economy and still managed to find joy in it. Karen swallowed hard. "I don't know," she admitted. Jeffrey nodded, as if that answer told him everything he needed to know. And Karen realized maybe it told her something, too. Karen stared at the untouched glass of water in front of her, Jeffrey's question lingering in her mind. "Do you even enjoy first class?" It should have been a ridiculous question. Of course she did. First class was about status, luxury, exclusivity, everything she had worked for. But the longer she sat there, the more uncertain she felt. Had she ever actually enjoyed it? Or had she just expected it to make her happy? She stole a glance at Jeffrey. He wasn't watching her anymore. He had gone back to reading his magazine, perfectly at ease, despite everything that had happened on this flight. Meanwhile, she was sitting here, uncomfortable in a seat she had fought to have, trapped in a situation she had created for herself. For the first time, Karen wondered, had she been making herself miserable all along? A soft commotion broke her train of thought. Across the aisle, a flight attendant was kneeling beside an elderly woman, speaking in a hushed but urgent voice. Karen sat up slightly, catching snippets of the conversation. "Sir, are you feeling all right? You look pale." The woman, clearly distressed, was clutching the arm of an older man beside her. His head was slumped slightly forward, his breathing shallow. Passengers nearby murmured in concern. Karen's heart rate picked up. Something was wrong. Before she could process it, Jeffrey was already moving. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, his face instantly shifting into calm focus. "I'm a trained pilot," he said to the flight attendant. "I've had basic emergency medical training." "What's going on?" The flight attendant looked relieved. He was fine earlier, but he suddenly said he felt lightheaded. Then he got quiet. Jeffrey knelt beside the older man. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man blinked sluggishly, barely responsive. His wife looked panicked. "He has a heart condition," she said, voice shaking. "He took his medication before the flight, but I don't know if it's working." Karen watched as Jeffrey's entire demeanor changed. Gone was the easygoing passenger. In his place was a leader. "Flight attendants, we need oxygen," Jeffrey said firmly. "And tell the pilot to check if there's a doctor on board." The crew moved quickly. Within seconds, an oxygen mask was placed over the man's face. Jeffrey helped adjust it, speaking softly to the wife, keeping her calm. Karen sat frozen, watching. She had never seen someone so effortlessly take control, not out of arrogance, not out of superiority, but because he genuinely cared. Passengers whispered around her. Some looked on with admiration. Others murmured about how lucky they were to have him on board. And Karen realized something. This was true power. Not money, not status, not being seated in first class, but the ability to make a difference. Jeffrey wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't just a CEO. He was someone who made things better. Karen swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat. For so long, she had believed wealth was the ultimate goal. But right now, nobody cared how much money Jeffrey Simmons had. They only cared that he was the kind of person who stepped up when it mattered. And Karen? She wasn't sure she could say the same about herself. For the first time in her entire life, she wondered what if she had been chasing the wrong thing all along? The cabin had fallen into an uneasy silence. Passengers whispered, their eyes darting toward the elderly man now receiving oxygen. His wife sat beside him, clutching his hand, relief washing over her face as his breathing steadied. Jeffrey remained by his side, ensuring he was stable. Karen, still seated, couldn't tear her eyes away. For so long, she had assumed power was about status, about having the best seat, the best service, the best treatment. But power wasn't about being above others. It was about being the person people could count on. And that was exactly what Jeffrey Simmons had been for everyone on this flight. Karen's stomach twisted. What had she ever done for anyone? A flight attendant approached Jeffrey. "Sir, we just received word from the cockpit. We'll be landing in about 20 minutes. Emergency personnel will be waiting at the gate." Jeffrey nodded. "Good. Let's keep monitoring him until then." As he stood, he caught Karen watching him. For the first time, she didn't look away. Instead, she took a deep breath and did something she had never done before. She extended her hand. Jeffrey raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "A real apology," Karen said, keeping her voice even. "Not just words. I mean it this time." Jeffrey studied her for a moment. Then, with a small smirk, he shook her hand. "All right," he said. "I believe you." Karen let out a small breath. That felt different. Better. A few minutes later, the captain's voice crackled through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are stowed." Karen tightened her belt, staring out the window as the city lights below grew closer. This flight had been nothing like she had planned. But maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing. She turned back to Jeffrey. "Can I ask you something?" Jeffrey glanced at her, amused. "You mean I have a choice this time?" Karen rolled her eyes, but smiled a real one. "Why did you let me take your seat? You could have easily said no." Jeffrey chuckled. "I could have. But I figured you needed the lesson more than I needed the seat." Karen blinked. "You did this on purpose?" "Not all of it," Jeffrey admitted. "But I saw how you looked at me when you boarded. I knew exactly what you thought." He shrugged. "I've dealt with worse." Karen felt her face heat with shame. "And you didn't call me out on it?" Jeffrey smiled. "You called yourself out. That's more valuable than anything I could have said." Karen let out a slow breath. He was right. And for the first time in her life, she was glad to have been wrong. As the plane touched down, passengers clapped, relieved to be on solid ground. Karen reached for her things, pausing when she spotted her designer handbag being carried down the aisle by a flight attendant. The woman smiled. "Your bag arrived safely, Miss Thompson." Karen took it, but for the first time ever, it didn't feel like the most important thing in the world. As she stood, she turned back to Jeffrey. "Next time," she said, "I think I'll be okay in economy." Jeffrey smirked. "I'll believe it when I see it." Karen laughed, shaking her head. As they stepped off the plane, she glanced back one last time at the seat she had fought for and hated sitting in. Then she looked forward. For the first time in a long time, she wanted to be better. And maybe, just maybe, this was the first step. Sometimes, life puts us in unexpected situations to teach us the lessons we never knew we needed. Karen boarded that flight believing status meant everything, but by the time she landed, she had learned that character matters far more than class. We all have moments where we misjudge people or situations. But what truly defines us is whether we're willing to learn from those mistakes. What about you? Have you ever experienced a moment that completely changed your perspective? Let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another one. See you in the next video.